Right now, in a funeral home somewhere in Florida, a family is being asked one question: burial or cremation. They think it's a logistics decision, maybe a budget decision. The Book of Enoch treats it as the most consequential choice they'll ever make on someone else's behalf, because according to the oldest surviving account of the afterlife in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the fate of the ashes and the fate of the body in the ground are not the same story. For over 300 years, the early church buried its dead because it was terrified of what Enoch describes, and because Rome knew it. Roman executioners started burning Christian martyrs on purpose, aiming not at the body but at the promise attached to it. By the end of this video, you'll understand what that promise was, what the text says actually happens to the spirit the moment the body stops existing, and why one line buried in chapter 51 splits the human race into 3 categories the moment they die. It starts with a mountain Enoch was shown in the west, made of rock so smooth he said it frightened him. Enoch didn't imagine the afterlife. According to the text, he was taken there and given a tour by an angel who introduces himself before he explains anything: Raphael. The first thing Raphael shows him isn't heaven. It's a mountain in the west, hard rock hollowed out into 4 chambers, deep and smooth and dark. Enoch's own reaction is on the page. He says the hollow places are so deep and dark, to look at that they unsettle him. This is chapter 22, and it's the oldest detailed floor plan of the afterlife that survives from the ancient world, predating Dante and the medieval church's version of hell, along with almost anything you've been taught to picture when someone says underworld. What makes this different from the Sunday school version most people grew up with is that it isn't 1 waiting room, it's 4, and Raphael explains why. 3 of the chambers are dark, 1 is bright, with a spring of water running through it. The spirits of the righteous go into the bright one, where they are refreshed, given light and water while they wait, rather than left unconscious or asleep. The other 3 chambers hold different categories of the wicked and the wronged. 1 holds sinners who were never punished during their lifetime, people who got away with it and died comfortable and unbothered. Raphael says this chamber exists so their case doesn't simply evaporate when they do, and their spirits are held there in pain until judgment because the record has to balance. Another chamber is reserved specifically for people who were murdered, the innocent dead crying out for justice, the way Abel's blood is described crying out from the ground in Genesis. In detail, that's remarkable for a text this old. Enoch is being shown that death doesn't erase the moral ledger, it preserves it. What matters is that nowhere in this scene, nowhere in the entire chapter describing the 4 hollow places, does the method of burial come up. Raphael never says a chamber is for those buried properly or for those denied a grave. What determines which chamber a spirit enters is what the person did while they had a body, not what happened to the corpse afterward. That detail becomes important later, because it contradicts the fear that would come to define an entire religious institution a few centuries on. We'll get to how the institutional church built a doctrine on top of a fear Enoch never actually confirms, but first it's worth seeing what happens to the body Enoch leaves behind. The text returns to it on purpose, 29 chapters later. Chapter 51 contains one of the most quoted resurrection passages in Second Temple Jewish literature, quoted because it's strange, specific, and oddly legalistic for a description of the end of the world. It says that in the last days the earth will give back what has been entrusted to it, then that Sheol will give back what it has received, and then, as a separate clause, that destruction will give back what it owes. Most people skim past that, but it names 3 different custodians with 3 different verbs for what each is holding. The earth holds bodies that were buried in it. Sheol holds the spirits Enoch just spent chapter 22 touring, and a 3rd category, called destruction, or in some translations Abaddon, holds something it owes, a debt rather than a deposit. The structure of the passage is telling you that not everyone who dies gets sorted the same way. Some go to the earth, some to Sheol, and some go somewhere the text treats as categorically different, which raises an obvious question for a modern reader. What does destruction mean for a body that fire, rather than soil has claimed. By the 2nd century, that question wasn't theoretical anymore, it was being weaponized. Roman magistrates found something that terrified the early Christian community more than execution itself, and they used it deliberately. When Christians were put to death for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor, some Roman officials ordered the bodies burned and the ashes scattered into rivers, specifically because they knew what Christians believed about resurrection and wanted to mock it. The message was simple and cruel. Your God can't rebuild what we've turned to smoke. Historical accounts describe believers risking their own lives, sneaking past guards and bribing soldiers just to recover the burned remains of martyrs so they could be buried instead of left in ash. People were willing to risk death a second time to give a corpse a grave, because the grave itself had become a statement of faith. This is where the different fate starts to take a specific historical shape. The early church didn't just prefer burial out of custom, it built a vocabulary around it. They called their burial grounds koimeteria, a Greek word for sleeping place or dormitory, because the belief was that the body wasn't gone but resting, waiting to be woken. That word is where cemetery comes from, so anyone who says they're visiting a cemetery today is using a word built on the assumption that what's underneath is dormant rather than destroyed. Cremation had no place in that worldview, because it was literally the Roman pagan alternative, a practice rooted in the belief that the body was a prison the soul needed to escape through fire. That's the opposite of the Hebrew and early Christian conviction that the body was sacred, owed dignity, and going to be needed again. This went beyond preference and hardened into doctrine for most of church history, and this holds true today in Eastern Orthodoxy, in traditional Catholicism, and notably in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the institution that preserved the complete Book of Enoch when every other branch of Christianity let it vanish for over 1,000 years. Cremation wasn't simply discouraged. It was treated as a direct symbolic denial of the resurrection. Byzantine canon law banned it outright. The Catholic Church maintained a formal prohibition for centuries, only loosening it in the 20th century, and even now insists the ashes be buried rather than scattered, kept on a mantle or divided among family members, because scattering looks, to the institutions that built this doctrine, like an attempt to make the resurrection impossible. But every one of those institutions, when pressed, admits the same thing. God's power isn't actually limited by fire. A 3rd century Christian writer, Minucius Felix, said as much, defending believers against the accusation that cremation could defeat resurrection by arguing that Christians don't fear harm from the manner of burial, they simply hold to the older, better custom. That's a significant concession. It suggests the fear was never really theological but symbolic, about what burial represents rather than what it's biologically or spiritually capable of undoing. That gap between what the institutions taught people to fear and what the source text actually says is where this video is headed next. Going back to Enoch himself, to the mountain with 4 rooms, and to the earth, Sheol, and destruction, all giving back something at the end of days, produces a picture that's stranger, and in some ways more unsettling than burn the body and you're doomed. What actually determines your fate according to the oldest version of this story has almost nothing to do with what your family chooses at the funeral home. It has to do with which of Enoch's 3 custodians was already holding you before you ever died. What the institutional fear conveniently skips is that in Enoch's own cosmology, fire isn't a threat to the dead in general. It's a punishment reserved for a specific kind of dead, and it has nothing to do with crematoriums. Chapter 90 describes a final judgment scene, witnessed directly by Enoch, where a fiery abyss opens in the middle of the earth. Corrupt spiritual authorities are judged first and thrown into it. Then a second group is brought, whom Enoch calls blinded sheep, a symbol for those who abandoned righteousness and led others astray, and they too are judged, found guilty, and cast into that same abyss. The text says plainly that they burned, and their bones burned with them. That's the fire Enoch is actually concerned with, not a furnace at a modern funeral home, but a judicial fire applied after death, by verdict, to the guilty, regardless of whether their body had already returned to dust decades earlier. Chapter 108, the last chapter of the book, reinforces this. Enoch describes a place that isn't part of the normal earth, saying explicitly, there is no earth there, where the spirits of sinners and blasphemers are cast into a blazing, roaring fire, weeping and crying out in what the text calls strong pain. Enoch is describing a location separate from soil, from a grave, from anything a coroner or mortician could touch. The fire happens to the spirit, not the remains, in a location the text says doesn't physically exist on the planet you were buried or burned on. Whatever happened to your body on the day of your funeral, this passage makes clear, isn't what determines whether you end up here. This flips the premise the institutional church built its cremation doctrine on. The fear was always that burning the body put the resurrection at risk. Enoch's text suggests the opposite. The fire that actually threatens you isn't lit by a mortician following your family's wishes. It's a fire that opens up after judgment for people who earned it through what they did while alive rather than how their corpse was disposed of. The 70 corrupt shepherds in chapter 90 weren't punished because someone cremated them. They were punished for decades of decisions Enoch describes in detail across the chapters leading up to their judgment. The body was never the variable, the life was. Chapter 51, with the earth giving back what it holds, Sheol giving back what it holds, and destruction giving back what it owes, reads differently now. It's tempting, and it's the obvious modern reading, to assume that third category, destruction or Abaddon, is where the cremated end up. A special holding place for any one fire has already claimed before the resurrection begins. There's a certain logic to that reading, since the text does seem to draw a line between bodies entrusted to soil and something else owed by destruction. But Enoch never actually collapses that distinction into cremated versus buried. What the text draws instead is a line between the ordinary dead, buried in earth or held in Sheol's 4 chambers, waiting peacefully or in torment depending on how they lived, and something the ancient audience would have understood as total, violent, chaotic ruin, closer to being swallowed whole than to any ordinary funeral. The people Enoch consistently associates with fire, the abyss, and no earth there aren't ordinary dead of any disposal method. They're the 70 corrupt shepherds, the blinded sheep who led a nation astray, and the fallen watchers themselves, bound and eventually thrown into a burning pit in chapter 10 for crimes that reshaped the entire pre-flood world. Enoch reserves this fate for people whose corruption was cosmic in scale, and the unsettling implication for a modern reader isn't that a routine cremation puts you in that category. It's that the category exists at all, independent of anything a family chooses at a funeral. Enoch says across 4 separate chapters that the only thing being measured is what you did with the years you had a body to do it in. The different fate this video promised isn't the one the institutions warned about. It isn't that the cremated get a worse room in the afterlife, a longer wait, or a weaker resurrection. An entire branch of Christian doctrine, cemeteries called sleeping places, martyrs' bodies smuggled out of Roman fires, centuries of canon law, was built defending against a threat the source text itself never actually makes. Enoch's fire targeted what people did with the body while it still had a heartbeat in it, not the ashes left after. That should change how you think about every funeral decision you've agonized over, and every one you'll help make for someone else. The 4 chambers in that mountain, and the earth, Sheol, and destruction giving back what they hold, aren't sorted by urn or coffin. They're sorted by a record the text insists nothing erases, whether fire, soil, or 1,000 years of waiting. That raises a harder question than burial or cremation ever was. If your fate was never in the hands of a funeral director, whose hands is it actually in, and how much of your life is already on a page you can't see, waiting to be read back to you? Enoch doesn't just answer that question for ordinary people. He He answers it for the one figure the entire book has been building toward, a bloodline the text says will stand directly against the Antichrist without knowing what they are. That's the story the next video tells. The Book of Enoch says the Antichrist has an enemy bloodline, and they don't know who they are.